London. 1868. A woman named Sarah Hartley walked into a pharmacy on Whitechapel Road, handed over a penny, and bought enough laudanum to sedate her 3 children for a full working day. She did not think of this as a drug transaction. The government did not think of it as a drug transaction. The pharmacy did not even require her name. She was a textile worker. Her shift ran 14 hours. There was no childcare. There was no alternative. The children, 7, 4, and 2, were given a preparation called Godfrey's Cordial. It contained opium, treacle, water, and spices, and it was marketed as a soother for restless infants. Medical officers across England were watching children die from it. In Manchester alone, contemporary accounts recorded that 5 out of every 6 working-class families used opium preparations on their children habitually, not occasionally. Habitually. The Victorian government was simultaneously running the largest drug trafficking operation in human history, shipping hundreds of thousands of pounds of opium from India into China every year, fighting 2 wars to protect the right to do it, and watching opium revenues fund nearly 15 to 20% of the entire British colonial budget. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. What happened inside the dens of Limehouse and the backroom pharmacies of Manchester was not a story about Chinese sailors and exotic vice. It was a story about control, about who got to be sedated and who got to profit from the sedation. And the machinery that made it work is running on a slightly different fuel in the United States right now. Here is the story. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, did not originate in the opium dens of Victorian London. It originated in the Western Mediterranean and Fertile Crescent, in the sun-bleached hills of what is now Turkey, Greece, and the region stretching into modern-day Iraq. People in the ancient world had been harvesting its resin for roughly 6,000 years before a single Englishman ever laid eyes on one. Here is what 6,000 years ago looks like. People were cultivating opium poppies in the Eastern Mediterranean, somewhere around 3400 BC, more than 5,000 years before the United States existed as a country. The Sumerians, the earliest civilization in Mesopotamia, called the poppy hul gil, which translates roughly to joy plant. They were not being poetic. They were being precise. The process of obtaining opium from the poppy is one of the most specific harvesting rituals in agricultural history, and it has not materially changed in 6,000 years. You wait until the petals of the poppy flower fall away, leaving behind a green seed pod roughly the size of a small fist. You make shallow incisions in that pod with a blade, not too deep, not too shallow, and then you wait. The pod responds to the wound by weeping. A milky white latex oozes out of the cuts, exposed to the afternoon air. By morning, the latex has oxidized to a sticky, dark brown resin with a bitter smell that sits somewhere between vinegar and licorice. That resin is raw opium. Scrape it off. Dry it. You now have one of the most powerful psychoactive substances the natural world produces. The ancient Egyptians documented its cultivation in the Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BC, a medical text describing opium preparations for pain relief and as a soporific for crying children. The Assyrians used it. The Greeks used it. Alexander the Great's armies carried it east into Persia and India, introducing the plant to cultures that would eventually transform it from a folk remedy into a global commodity. Greek physicians mixed opium into wine, called the mixture meconium, and recommended it for everything from battlefield wounds to insomnia. The Arab world inherited the Greek medical tradition and expanded it dramatically during the Islamic Golden Age, between roughly the 7th and 13th centuries. Arab physicians like Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, documented opium's properties in encyclopedic detail, describing its ability to suppress pain, reduce respiration, and produce a profound, almost architectural sensation of calm. Arab trade routes carried opium preparations across Persia, into India, and eventually along the Silk Road toward China. The distance those routes covered was roughly equivalent to driving from New York City to Los Angeles 4 times over. But the critical transformation, the one that set the stage for everything that followed, happened in the 17th century, in the tobacco pipes of Southeast Asia. Opium had been eaten and drunk in liquid preparations for millennia. The effects were powerful but gradual. Then, somewhere in Southeast Asia in the 1600s, people began mixing opium with tobacco and smoking it. The difference was not marginal, it was categorical. When you eat or drink opium, it passes through your digestive system and reaches your bloodstream over the course of an hour or more. When you smoke it, the active compounds reach your brain in seconds. The rush is faster, more intense, more immediately addictive, and the craving it produces, that specific quality of yearning to return to the pipe, is unlike anything opium prepared in any other form creates. The Chinese medical tradition had used opium in oral preparations for centuries, but when smoking arrived, first as a blend with tobacco, then as pure opium vaporized over a lamp, it spread through Chinese society with a velocity that alarmed the imperial court. By the mid-18th century, the Qing dynasty had issued multiple edicts banning opium smoking. The decrees existed. The smoking continued. The demand had been created, and demand, once created at sufficient scale, tends to find a supplier. The supplier was already waiting. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the modern world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between, I always want to know. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company controlled the Bengal Presidency in northeastern India, one of the most fertile opium-growing regions on Earth. The poppy fields of Bihar and Bengal produced raw opium that was processed at government factories in Patna and Benares, packed into large balls of standardized weight, auctioned off to private trading firms in Calcutta, and shipped to China. This was not a black market. This was not a side operation. This was the second largest revenue source for the entire British colonial government of India throughout the 19th century, averaging, by documented records, roughly 14.5% of total East India Company revenue. By the mid-19th century, under Queen Victoria, that figure ranged from 15 to 20% of British colonial income in India. The Queen's empire ran, in significant part, on drug money. The scale requires a moment to absorb. By the 1830s and 40s, the British were shipping somewhere between 40,000 and 70,000 chests of opium into China per year. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of processed opium. Do the math. The British were forcing somewhere between 5.6 million and nearly 10 million pounds of opium into China annually, every year, for decades. The Chinese Qing government estimated that by the 1830s, somewhere between 2 and 12 million Chinese subjects were addicted to opium. The British government's position was that free trade was sacrosanct. The Chinese government's position was that its population was being systematically addicted to a foreign drug, and something needed to be done. In 1839, the Chinese Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu made a decision that would echo across the next century and a half of global history. He ordered the seizure and destruction of all foreign opium held in Canton, roughly 20,000 chests, worth what would today be hundreds of millions of dollars. He also wrote a letter to Queen Victoria that is one of the most remarkable documents in 19th century diplomacy, asking her, on moral grounds, to stop the trade. He pointed out that opium was banned in Britain itself. He asked why Britain insisted on exporting to China what it forbade at home. Victoria did not reply personally. Britain declared war instead. The First Opium War ran from 1839 to 1842. Britain's ironclad steamships and modern artillery demolished the Qing Navy, a fleet of wooden junks armed with cannon technology generations behind the British. The Treaty of Nanjing ended the conflict. China was forced to pay Britain $21 million in reparations, open 5 major ports to foreign trade, and cede Hong Kong Island to Britain permanently. China also had to stand by and watch as British opium sales resumed and escalated. Britain was not done. The Second Opium War ran from 1856 to 1860, this time with France joining in. At its conclusion, the 1860 Convention of Beijing formalized what the British had wanted all along. The opium trade was not just tolerated, but legalized under Chinese law. Britain had fought 2 wars, killed thousands, and seized sovereign territory in order to maintain its right to sell drugs. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Back in England, the opium flowing through the imperial economy was creating a domestic drug crisis that the Victorian ruling class was remarkably unbothered by, provided it was the right people doing the consuming. Laudanum was the delivery mechanism. An alcoholic tincture of opium containing roughly 10% opium by weight, it was available without prescription at every pharmacy and corner druggist in England. It had been called the aspirin of the 19th century, and the comparison is not hyperbole. Queen Victoria took it, Charles Dickens took it, Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge consumed it in quantities that would floor a modern emergency room physician. Reportedly up to 480 grains of opium per day at the peak of his dependence. But the people consuming laudanum in the drawing rooms of Kensington were consuming it as a medical and social luxury. The people consuming it in the tenements of Manchester and the fens of East Anglia were consuming it as a survival mechanism. At 1 penny per dose, roughly the cost of a pint of beer, laudanum was accessible to the poorest workers in England. Textile workers in Manchester, who worked 14-hour shifts in deafening mills in air thick with cotton fibre, drank laudanum for the pain in their lungs and their hands. Women giving birth in conditions that would horrify any modern American physician received laudanum. Workers laid off during economic downturns drank it because it suppressed hunger. The infant mortality numbers are where this becomes almost unbearable to look at. Medical officers across Victorian England were documenting in their official reports that the routine administration of opium preparations to working-class infants was one of the leading contributors to infant death in industrial cities. In Nottingham, a single council member and pharmacist documented selling 400 gallons of laudanum per year. One Manchester druggist admitted selling a half gallon of Godfrey's Cordial per week, plus 5 to 6 gallons per week of a preparation the trade called simply quietness. Thousands of infants were dosed into sedation every week so that their parents could work. The physical description left by doctors who examined these infants, shrunken into little old men, wizened like little monkeys, is not metaphor. It is clinical observation. The working class was being sedated, efficiently, cheaply, without coercion, because coercion was not necessary when economic desperation did the work instead. Quick question. How many American households today have an opioid prescription in the medicine cabinet right now? Not a rhetorical question. Drop your guess in the comments. The actual number is going to matter in a few minutes. The opium dens that Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle made famous. Those dark, smoky rooms in Limehouse and Whitechapel, where Chinese sailors lay across mats in the thick, sweet haze of burning opium. These were real places. There were a handful of them in boarding houses near the London docks, where Chinese and Lascar sailors stayed between voyages. Historians Virginia Berridge and Griffith Edwards, in their landmark 1981 study on 19th century English opium use, established that there were never very many of these establishments, and that they primarily served sailors who had developed smoking habits in Asia. But the image of those dens, exotic, foreign, dangerous, populated by inscrutable Orientals and the occasional ruined English aristocrat who had slipped into degradation, that image was politically useful. It gave Victorian England a way to talk about opium addiction as a foreign problem, an import, something that arrived with Chinese sailors on dirty ships, rather than something manufactured, distributed and profited from by the British colonial apparatus itself. The Parliament of Victoria's England was running a global drug empire. The dens of Limehouse were a distraction. By the time the American Civil War ended in 1865, the United States had its own opium problem, and it had nothing to do with Chinese sailors. Military surgeons on both sides of that war had administered morphine, a purified alkaloid extracted from opium, isolated by a German chemist in 1805. by syringe to wounded soldiers at a scale that American medicine had never before attempted. The hypodermic syringe was a new invention. Morphine was the most effective painkiller available. Hundreds of thousands of men were wounded across 4 years of the bloodiest conflict in American history. When those men came home, many of them came home addicted. The condition was sometimes called soldier's disease. Hundreds of thousands of Union Army soldiers alone had received morphine during the war. Estimates of post-war addiction among veterans ran into the hundreds of thousands of individuals, a significant fraction of the men who had served. Simultaneously, American pharmaceutical companies and patent medicine manufacturers had built an enormous industry around opium-based preparations sold directly to civilian consumers. No prescription was required. No warning was necessary. No federal oversight existed. A Sears catalog in the 1880s would carry opium and morphine preparations alongside tools and seed stock. By the 1890s, American physicians and public health observers were beginning to describe an addiction crisis spreading through the middle classes, particularly among women, who were the primary target market for laudanum-based women's tonics and nerve remedies. The AMA was alarmed. State governments were beginning to pass patchwork regulations. The federal government had done nothing. Then, in 1898, the Bayer pharmaceutical company in Germany introduced a new product to the American market. They had synthesized diacetylmorphine, a modified form of morphine 3 times more powerful than its parent compound, and named it heroin, from the German heroisch, meaning heroic, because when Bayer tested it on their own workers, the workers described feeling enlarged, capable, and fearless. Bayer marketed heroin as a non-addictive cure for morphine addiction. They sold it in 23 countries within the first year of commercial release. They produced roughly a ton of it in 1899 alone. In the United States, heroin appeared in cough syrups and baby-soothing preparations. It was marketed toward children as medication during the height of the tuberculosis crisis. Reports of addiction began appearing within months of the drug's commercial release. Bayer kept selling it. Not until 1913 did Bayer discontinue production of heroin, as it became clear that regulators in multiple countries were about to act. The damage was done. Heroin addiction was already embedded in American cities. What I haven't told you yet is what the people selling you opioids right now already know, and have known for decades. In 1995, Purdue Pharma, a privately held pharmaceutical company based in Stamford, Connecticut, owned by the Sackler family, introduced OxyContin to the American market. OxyContin was a controlled-release formulation of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid derived from the same poppy alkaloid chain that produced morphine and heroin. The controlled-release mechanism was supposed to prevent abuse by delivering the drug slowly over 12 hours. The Sacklers' marketing pitch was specific and calculable. OxyContin was not addictive, they told doctors. The controlled-release formula made abuse difficult. Patients could take it for months or years without dependence. Sales representatives were coached to deliver these assurances. Doctors across rural America, in Appalachian Kentucky, in West Virginia, in suburban Ohio, in small communities across states like Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Maine, were visited by Purdue sales reps bearing lunches, gifts, and educational materials explaining that opioid medications, properly prescribed, carried an addiction risk of less than 1%. That figure had no serious scientific foundation. Purdue knew it. Court documents produced during subsequent litigation revealed that by 1999, the Sackler family was personally aware that OxyContin was being abused and that the company's claims about its addiction potential were not supportable. Their response, documented in internal communications produced during litigation, was to blame the addicts, to argue that patients who became dependent were people with pre-existing susceptibilities, moral failures, character deficiencies. The drug was fine. The people were broken. This is the part that should make you angry. OxyContin did not spread slowly or accidentally through the American population. Purdue ran one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in American history, specifically targeting primary care physicians in regions with high rates of physical labor, communities where coal miners, factory workers, and construction workers came to their doctors in pain and left with a prescription for a drug the company knew was dangerously addictive. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges for misbranding OxyContin. They paid $600 million in fines to the federal government. That settlement was treated by the company not as a punishment, but as a cost of doing business. Documents produced during subsequent litigation showed that within months of the 2007 settlement, members of the Sackler family were pushing for even more aggressive marketing of opioids. They hired the consulting firm McKinsey, which in internal communications explicitly discussed strategies to turbocharge Purdue's opioid sales, even as overdose deaths were visibly mounting. The FDA knew OxyContin was being abused. The DEA knew. Congressional investigators knew. For years, the regulatory apparatus of the United States government watched the crisis develop, received documented evidence of Purdue's deceptive marketing, and moved slowly, while hundreds of thousands of Americans died. The Sackler family extracted an estimated $10 to $12 billion from Purdue Pharma over the years they controlled the company. They moved substantial portions of that money into accounts in foreign countries and family trusts in the years before Purdue filed for bankruptcy in 2019, as litigation was closing in. Congressional investigators from the House Oversight Committee documented this explicitly in 2020. When Purdue finally reached a comprehensive settlement with all 50 states, a $7.4 billion agreement that became legally effective in May 2026, the Sacklers were permanently barred from selling opioids in the United States and required to release more than 30 million internal documents, including attorney-client privileged communications about OxyContin's original FDA approval. 30 million documents, every one of them covering decisions that were made while Americans died. The human cost is documented by the CDC with a specificity that is difficult to look at directly. From 1999 through 2023, approximately 806,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. In 2022 alone, more than 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses, the majority opioid-related. That is more Americans than died in the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and the Gulf War combined. It is more people than the entire population of Green Bay, Wisconsin, dying in a single year. The states hit hardest, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, are not coincidentally the states where Purdue's sales representatives were most aggressively deployed in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They are states with high concentrations of physical laborers. They are states with communities that trusted their doctors and their pharmacists and believed that a drug approved by the FDA and marketed by a pharmaceutical company with Harvard-educated executives was safe. The opioid crisis did not fall from the sky. It was architected. The marketing strategies were designed in boardrooms in Stamford, Connecticut. The legal strategies to avoid accountability were drafted by lawyers billing by the hour. The lobbying campaigns that slowed federal regulation were run by professionals who understood exactly what they were doing. Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers knew. 1999, they knew. And they kept going for more than 20 years while Americans paid the price in lives. Here is a number. Nearly 1 in 3 American adults reported in a 2022 KFF survey that they or a family member had been addicted to opioids. Not exposed to opioids, not prescribed opioids. Addicted. Americans consume more opioid pain medication per capita than any other country in the world. Not by a narrow margin, by a factor that researchers describe as staggering. The opioid pain medication market in the United States generates tens of billions of dollars per year. Chain pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, have dispensed more opioid prescriptions than there are people in this country in certain years. The connection back to Victorian England is not a metaphor. It is direct lineage. The poppy cultivated in the fields of the Fertile Crescent for 6,000 years. The trade routes that carried it across the ancient world. The Arab chemists who refined its preparations. The British East India Company that built a colonial empire on its export. The Opium Wars that forced it into China at gunpoint. The returning American Civil War veterans who came home addicted to morphine. The German chemist at Bayer who synthesized heroin and called it non-addictive. The Sackler family who ran the same play one more time in 1995, with better lawyers and worse odds of going to prison. Each generation produced a new delivery mechanism and a new claim that this version, finally, was the safe one. Each generation turned out to be wrong. Each generation of patients paid the price while somebody else collected the profit. The $7.4 billion settlement with Purdue is the largest opioid settlement in American history. It sounds enormous. The Sackler family extracted an estimated $10 to $12 billion from the company. They came out ahead. Opioid overdose deaths in the United States have begun to decline since their peak, from nearly 108,000 in 2022 to roughly 105,000 in 2023. By 2024, that figure had dropped further to around 54,000, driven largely by shifts in the illicit drug supply and expanded availability of naloxone, the overdose reversal medication. The crisis is not over. The deaths are still happening at rates 6 times higher than they were in 1999. More than 800,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses since the epidemic began. That number is nearly as large as the entire population of San Francisco, California. You will find opioid medications at CVS. You will find them at Walgreens. You will find them prescribed in every hospital in the country, dispensed in every state, managed under every kind of insurance plan. The medications themselves are not the problem. Pain is real, surgery is real, cancer is real, and opioids remain among the most effective analgesics medicine has ever developed. The problem is the system. Who controls it? Who profits from it? Who pays when it fails? And who gets to define what failure means? Slow down here for a moment. Everything that happened in the opium dens of Victorian London was legal. Everything the East India Company did in China was a deliberate policy choice made by elected officials and corporate boards who understood exactly what they were doing. The laudanum sold to Sarah Hartley in Whitechapel was a legal product sold by a licensed pharmacist in accordance with the laws of her country. Everything Purdue Pharma did was, for most of its duration, technically legal, or at least operating inside the margins of a regulatory system that was either too slow, too captured, or too unwilling to act. The marketing was aggressive and deceptive, but it was marketing. The political contributions to slow regulation were legal contributions to legal campaigns. The decisions to keep selling through mounting evidence of harm were decisions made in conference rooms by people who would go home to their families that night. The Victorian mill worker drinking laudanum to get through a 14-hour shift in 1868, and the person picking up a 30-day opioid prescription at a Walgreens in 2002 are separated by a century and a half, an ocean, and the entire industrial transformation of the modern world. They are connected by a single continuous logic, that a population in pain is a market, that markets can be managed, and that the people who manage them will not, without sustained pressure, choose a different outcome for the people below them. How many things in your daily life right now were shaped by a decision made in a boardroom that you never got to vote on? Think about that. Sit with it. Have you ever looked at what's actually in the medications in your medicine cabinet right now? Not just what they do, but where the molecule came from, who synthesized it, who funded the trial that approved it, and whether the company that sold it knew something about it that they did not tell your doctor. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that shaped your life, subscribe, hit the like button. It tells me you want to keep going deeper. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the world works. The poppy has been growing in human soil for 6,000 years. They built an empire on it. They fought 2 wars for it. They sedated the poor with it, called it medicine, called it progress, and when the addiction was too visible to ignore, they blamed the addicts. The next time you walk past the pharmacy counter at your local CVS and see the locked cabinet behind the counter, You'll know exactly what it took to get here, and you will never be able to unknow it.